In this session, we discuss the troubled history of family therapy, the always effective lunch session, and results-based accountability and the great promise of family therapy. Welcome to the After Podcast. I am Naveed Zamani and I am your host. In this session, I'll be speaking with Dr. H. Charles Fishman. H. Charles Fishman, MD, trained in family therapy's halcyon days at Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic with Salvador Minuchin, Braulio Montalvo, and Jay Haley. He co-authored the foundational book Family Therapy Techniques with Salvador Minuchin. His latest book is Performance-Based Family Therapy, A Therapist's Guide to Lasting Change by Routledge. Charles, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Let me give a little bit of my background and how I got into family therapy and how I was introduced to Dr. Minuchin and the other esteemed teachers.
Yeah, please do. And then if you can, take us into the 2024 and where your thinking is at here and today.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yep. I studied philosophy in college. And a lot of interesting ideas. But then I realized this seems very much like religious training. Nobody convinced anybody to change their mind. There were cool ideas, but everybody was held on to their ideas for whatever reasons. So I said, listen, I need to go into a field that has real science. So I went into medicine, and there was a lot of really good science. You'd postulate, if we use this medication, this problem that's bothering the patient will be improved. And then exploring, there were blood tests that gave an indication of whether the medication worked. But my real love in medicine was psychiatry. So I chose after graduation, I found a program for my residency at the University of Pennsylvania, and it was a broad-based program. In those days, there were two psychoanalytic institutes in Philadelphia. CBT was just starting. One of my teachers was Aaron Beck. There was a lot of psychopharmacology and a lot of brilliant people around me. In those days, you could do child psychiatry general psychiatry for 2 years, and for 2 years, you could do child psychiatry. I was very discouraged during my first 2 years. I said to myself, I'm back in philosophy class. There are all of these theories, and for the most part, a paucity of data. Again, everybody was holding on, and they were also holding on to a lot of their psychoanalytic ideas. But during my first 2 years, I kept hearing rumors that across campus, Salvador Minuchin at the Child Guidance Clinic was curing juvenile diabetes, with family therapy. Of course, he wasn't curing the medical problem, but he was stemming the exacerbation.
That's quite the reputation.
So I called, and as luck would have it, in the parking lot, I met a colleague of mine who was a year ahead of me. He said, listen, I'm not going to the Child Guidance Clinic. My wife has just had a baby. I've got to go into private practice. So I called Minuchin. I said, I understand you have a place in your fellowship program. And he said, yes. Why don't you come over and talk to me? So I met with him, and we hit it off. And he made perfect sense. Finally, after all these years of education, somebody made perfect sense. I asked him at one point, and brainwashed that it's deep therapy if you work with somebody and their feelings. And Nietzsche preferred it's deep therapy if you deal with that part of the psyche.
All right.
And Nietzsche would refer to psychoanalysis. He was a trained psychoanalyst, and mostly as crap. Made no sense. I asked him a question that if you're not doing deep therapy, what maintains the problem? And he said, well, you're working with the whole family and you're changing everybody at the same time. So they maintain the new stage that they're in jointly.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody participates in the new status quo. And so that was really the beginning. And I fell in love with family therapy when I would start working with anorectics. In those days, and in many places, the anorectics would be in the hospital for a long time.
Hmm.
But with the family therapy, they would start eating usually at the end of the session.
Wow.
And I said to myself, that really works. That's very impressive.
That's a huge shift in the prognosis.
Oh, absolutely. And they were doing, the Minuchin work with Bernice Rossman, who was a psychologist. First, he started out at the Wilfig School for Boys. To give a little bit of his history. And it was founded by Eleanor Roosevelt. It was troubled kids being treated in Harlem.
Oh.
And he said to me, I would visit him every year. And I said at one point, he said, Al, how did you get into family therapy? He said, well, I had a very smart assistant, secretary. And one day she said to me, Dr. Medici, you said the same thing about this boy a year ago, and now he's back. And so I said, well, maybe we should look at the families. And he started working with Bernice and Morello Montalvo, who lived in a small town in Puerto Rico, was completely brilliant and a great friend and a great teacher of mine. Like Sal, he's passed away. And they published the book Families of the Slums. That was adding family therapy. The book was published in 1967. Could you imagine how advanced that was? And then he went to the Child Guidance Clinic and did work with anorexia, which I will talk about. So you asked me, what are the issues that are on my mind? What keeps me up at night?
Yeah, what's capturing your attention in your work, given the rich storied history that you hold, especially with, like you said, things that were so advanced for their time?
Oh, absolutely. But they're advanced, but they're marginalized.
Hmm.
And we thought for sure at the Child Guidance Clinic, where everybody was doing family therapy, and had these brilliant people, that family therapy would change the world. It didn't. Family therapy, in many ways, has become one more technique, like psychoanalysis or adding medications.
Hmm.
It is by no means an overall paradigm, which it's meant to be, and done well. It is just that. In essence, it's Bateson's idea of mind in context.
Right.
If you work with the individual in their context, you get great change. And okay, let me just get some notes here.
Yeah. So I want to say how much I'm appreciating what you're saying here. There's a trend of folks who are trained in family therapy and kind of the Yeah, I really like what you're saying about family therapy is not a technique, but an overall paradigm and how influential Bateson has been to those ideas. And what you're
Yeah,
saying makes me think of something I've heard Mona Fishbane say, that there's no single mind, right? That any mind is connected to other minds, and that, yeah, there's no individual or autonomous person. We all exist within a broader context environment. If I'm hearing you right, too,
yeah.
Charles, that to be an effective family therapist, I think this is what you're saying in some ways is you need to be attending to the environment and the context in which families are in.
Oh, absolutely. In many ways, that's the mind is profoundly affected by the context.
Yeah.
And the context is really the milieu with which one changes the psychological problems.
Yeah.
So let me organize this.
Yeah, I want to appreciate too, as you're looking at your notes here, Charles, that one of the things that I've noticed in 2024, because when you ask, like, can you imagine how advanced I was in 1967? To be honest, I can't, because I don't know
Right?
what the context of the 60s and 70s were. I hear so many stories about this rich period of family therapy and I don't know, the energy of like, oh my God, family therapy is going to change the world. Uh,
Right.
and then the powerful force of neoliberalism and the ways that like therapy has become an individualized therapy or approach, and family therapy becomes an add-on technique or intervention when the individual therapy fails, perhaps.
Oh, absolutely. It's um, and there's a huge smorgasbord of models, and that are and people somehow feel that they do very well if they bring in different models, and that is not my experience at all. It confuses the therapy, it confuses the work.
Trying to bring in a lot of different models as a matter of like intervening. Is that kind of, am I hearing you right?
Well, it will. I mean, when you look at the various models, the neurofeedback, somatic, experiential,
Yeah,
meditation, mindfulness,
yeah.
ACT, DBT, um, and one really creates change when you roll up your sleeves and transform the context.
Yeah, this has been a challenging thing, especially in the teaching training context, because there's such a powerful cultural force around. I think especially I'm just riffing here. So listeners and yourself, Charles, like feel free to push back because maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but um,
No,
I'm
please.
I'm thinking even with like the advent and the powerful presence of coaching these days, and the way that coaching, as I experienced it, is kind of like trying to be a more even more intervention-y and targeted type of therapy. So students, I feel like, come in my experience, wanting to learn techniques. And I was drawn to your history in philosophy because in some ways I think of the work of a therapist as kind of philosophical in nature. Like, how do we live together and how do we live well? And what does it mean what does family mean? And what does family in the context of our broader systems mean? Like, these are all philosophical questions as far as I'm concerned. And the therapist brings these in with a particular approach, but then the models kind of turn it away a little bit from that into maybe a more, let's solve immediate problems and somehow maintain the status quo along the way as much as possible.
Well, the question is, what is your job? If our job is to have a really good conversation and wax philosophical or even wax psychoanalytic, I'm not I'm not recommending it, but it's not a theory. It's not a theory for change.
Right,
If people come to us, at the end of the day, we're a healing profession.
right.
The idea is how we heal people,
Yeah, I appreciate that.
and that is really why there people uh, come to see us to help them with their pain. And so, what we need to do is we find what is the most effective way to create an amelioration of their suffering.
Yeah. So can I ask you a question about that? Or I also don't want to
Oh,
disrupt,
sure, sure.
I don't want to
Oh, no,
disrupt
no, go ahead.
something else we're going to go on to.
Oh no, I'm happy to do it, and I'm lost in my notes anyway. So go right ahead.
So, this question of how do we heal people? As I understood in your story, you're, let me know if this is a fair take. I'm hearing about a young man who is in philosophy, wondering, okay, well, this feels like just religious ideologies that people are entrenched in. Where's like the change mechanism? And so then you go into the world of the medical world where you're kind of following data and interventions, and like healing is a little bit more quantitative sometimes. I mean, even that is a little bit of a stretch, but if that's fair to say.
Yeah,
And then you find out about this person who is having really profound effects in people's lives by targeting the family. And so then you kind of get training, and I mean, you're very involved with a pretty critical period of history in the family therapy world. How has your understanding, if that's a fair take, you can shift anything that I said there, or please
no,
do.
no, yeah, that's fine.
Uh, how has that shifted for you from when you were onto that in the 20th century to now in the 21st century? How has
Yeah,
this question of how do we heal people evolved?
yeah. Well, that's a very good question. Do you realize Families of the Slums was published close to 100 years ago? I mean, 1967. It's certainly 80 years ago. No, my thinking. You were saying how difficult it is to get trainees to learn family therapy, and I'm a great uh, advocate of Occam's razor.
Uh-huh.
You know Occam's razor,
I do,
which was
but
actually,
go ahead and say it. I think it'd be helpful for anyone listening that might not know it.
yeah, I mean, the simplest correct definition and the most transparent definition is the best.
It's often the best, right?
And the other part of it that is Minuchin's brilliance of looking at family structure. And that is, you can sit down with a family, or you can just watch the family in the waiting room before the session, and you know what the problem is.
Hmm.
During getting back to my own education, I was always involved and fascinated by the idea, Noam Chomsky's idea, and of deep structures, and Claude Levi-Strauss's ideas of deep structures. And in family systems, there are deep structures. So if you ask me how my thinking has changed, I've gotten simpler. My thinking is simpler.
Hmm.
There really aren't the social problem. I live in New Zealand. My wife and I, with kids, moved there. I was invited to do a project for 6 months. So we moved here 22 years ago. And so I do consulting to the most troubled cases in Auckland, which is a good-sized city, 1.5 million people. Not by California standards, but still a good-sized city. And in every family, there's a war at the center of the family.
Hmm.
As we discussed at the beginning. So, getting back to family therapy and the history of family therapy, which I what you'd call a second generation family therapist. So in the 80s, family therapy was the new kid on the block.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was doing it. Those rooms are storage rooms in many of the public agencies. Used to have one-way mirrors.
Right.
And all the leaders went across America and the world proselytizing, getting devotees with their models. So there was Virginia Satir, there was Murray Bowen, there was Sal and Jay, and myself to some extent. And but what the field never did which CBT did do. It didn't get together and say, what are ways in which have a generalized field theory of what family therapies do well with what problems. Now, Mnuchin did that in his work with Wildwick and his work with anorexic eating disorders. And they've survived the halcyon days. I mean, Mnuchin went to England in 1980 and influenced the Maudsley Clinic and taught them his model of anorexia. So they put together the Maudsley model of treating anorexia, very successful. But then in America, Stanford, Jim, forgot his last name, professor at Stanford, and somebody at University of Chicago and Columbia, they developed something called family-based treatment. So they do essentially the Mnuchin lunch session, or the equivalent, involved with family.
The Mnuchin lunch session?
You know what the lunch session is?
No, I haven't.
The Mnuchin lunch session is the parents would feed the child. A completely brilliant idea. Because what's maintaining, we don't know what causes the problems. What's maintaining the problems is a split between the parents. So getting them to pull together to the extent they get their child to eat, it cures the split between parents, at least for that moment, and the child eats, so the child is no longer a death's door, at least for that moment.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that. I love that. So you're creating a context where the parents come together around an organized task to care for the children.
Yeah.
And the therapist is kind of witness to this and observing and kind of.
The therapist is more than witnessed. The therapist is the producer of the drama.
Okay. Can you say more about that?
Okay, I can say a lot about that. There's some really good, brilliant research they did that I would show you if we had they developed the idea of the psychosomatic family. So they said, let's see what are some of the it's a new patient. The patient is the interactions between the family members. So they made they postulated that these families have diffusion of conflict, they have conflict avoidance, they have triangulation. You know what's meant by triangulation?
Yeah. I'm familiar from
they have triangulation. What?
I'm familiar with it from Bowen's work.
Yeah. Well, it's the opposite of Bowen's work. Okay. It's completely opposite, but it's the same idea. And that is, so there were three kinds of kids that were exchanged that had out of control diabetes, not anorexia, there's change in diabetes. That's what the research was done.
Okay.
So the three kinds were kids where doctors couldn't find out why the diabetes was so out of control. Mm-hmm. Another one were kids that violated the regimen and had a lot of sugar, and they're called behavioral diabetic kids. The third type is kids that live in psychosomatic families.
Okay.
And so they did research where a tape recorder would rate questions where questions would be posed to the family, and it was videotaped. And naive graduate students who didn't know which group they were in, which of the three groups they were in, would gauge whether this is a psychosomatic family. And with the conflict avoiding families, one of the questions is, say what you like or don't like about each other. The conflict avoiding families would go nowhere near that. And so they've discovered that this new patient, this psychosomatic family, is what is treated. Mm. So they work with these interactional patterns, and to the extent the patterns are mitigated, the anorexia or the diabetes or whatever it is ameliorated.
Interesting. Wow.
So you have a new patient. Your patient is these interactional patterns in the family system. And I've done this for 50 years. I've worked with many anorectics with this model. I can count on one hand times it has not been effective. It always works. There's something in medicine, it's the number needed to treat. And that is the number of people that take a new antibiotic, are they cured of their sore throat? The number needed to treat with anorectics using this model is 1-on-1. It always works.
Wow. Those are strong numbers.
Yeah, those are about as strong as you get, other than coming to Lourdes. They're about as good as you can get. So the issue is how to help the field move on.
Yeah. Because
you've gone to a very good program, and the field has, after the 80s, as Brian been telling me, when the legends roamed the land, family therapy split up. There were all these different little subgroups. I mean, there's narrative therapy, and there are all these models, and there's a whole variety of other therapies. And so what's necessary is, how do family therapists use the correct models? I mean, the other people that are not doing family therapy, they're hopeless. And in your community, you can't fail with these families. If it's the worried well, like cognitive dissonance theory, everybody loves their therapist because they're paying good money for their therapist.
Right.
They'd be a fool if they didn't like the therapist. But where you work on the front line with poor families, which is what I do and what we did at the Chuck Einstein, poorest of the poor, you got to be successful.
Yeah. Yeah. We have a lot of mandated clients too. So people that don't want therapy, or they're not so interested in an intervention, quote unquote.
Yeah. So we need to be successful.
Yeah. Yeah. The stakes are high.
Exactly. So in my new book, well, it's not terribly new anymore, but I was a Annie Casey Fellowship. I was a fellowship, Annie Casey Foundation's funded by UPS. And they take, every couple of years, they take leaders in the field, mostly in government, and help them with their leadership. And in my fellowship, which was in the 90s, I met a man named Mark Friedman, who had worked in the Baltimore Children's Services, State Services. And he was the financial person. And he said, we've spent a lot of money, and is anybody better off? So he put something together called RBA, Results-Based Accountability, which I introduced to my training and to my colleagues, and what I talk about in this book. RBA, first of all, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. That actually comes from the business press. So you want to figure out ways of measuring what you're doing. I mean, there are certain models in family therapy where they ask clients, do they like the therapist? Do they feel better? It can't be subjective stuff. You're back to religious class and you're back to BS. So you need to have grounded data that's grounded and you can track what's going on.
And the grounded data you're describing is some sort of feedback mechanism to track the therapist's performance.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Wait, now I'm like,
I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Give me an example. I would imagine you have this kids that have school avoidance.
Yeah.
The treatment of choice for school avoidance is school. How do you get the kids to school? The parents pull together and get their kid to school.
That's the Occam's razor in some ways.
Exactly. And how do you know their therapy is successful? Kids in school. And any number of problems. Now we use something that I don't. Do you work with children, both children and adults?
Both children and adults, yeah.
Okay, what we used for kids is the CAFAS, Child and Family Functional Assessment Scale. Developed, I learned that in the public systems in Philadelphia. And it again uses grounded data. And it's very good, but it's you find some marker. You can find it can be any kind of marker. And with RBA, the first step is you get all the stakeholders together and they determine what is the desired outcome.
Yeah. And
then you work backwards. You say, this is the outcome. What do we need to do to get that outcome? With the school avoidance, what you need to do is you meet with the family, join with the family, and you get them to get their kid to school. Now, sometimes it's hard work. You have to meet with them separately, perhaps, and get them together, or scare the living Jesus out of them. Are they very wealthy? If not, they're going to, because they should be, because they're going to be supporting their child who's not being educated. That's number one. Number two, there was a scorecard.
Yeah. I'm so I'm fascinated by this, Charles, because in some ways the context that you're describing, correct me if I'm wrong, you're describing context where measurable data is in some ways available in the relationship the person holds to some system, like the school, like the data is if they're going to school or not. Anorexia, I imagine there's measurable outcomes there in terms of
oh yeah, the scale helps. A scale helps, yeah.
Like how much you're eating and stuff, and then same with diabetes. How do you start thinking about, and maybe it's not even a question worth asking, but I like some of the more subjective goals or outcomes people want, like contentment in a relationship or satisfaction.
Okay, that's a very good one. Let's do contentment. So first of all, if it's an individual that's discontent, you bring in the relationship. In other words, if someone's unhappy in the relationship, you have to work with the contemporary forces in their life. And that can be their spouse. It could be the parent that calls them 3 times a day. It can be children that are driving them crazy, or the biological kids of their new husband. And then you work with that partner. It's again, what is the context? It's always the contemporary context that needs to be transformed.
So any individualized goal is necessarily pulled into a more relational dynamic, and that's where the goals and the outcomes and perhaps the measurements start to be crafted. Is because then it's still maybe subjective amongst the individuals, but still, if you have multiple data points in which you're getting data.
Well, your point is well taken. Give me another case.
I'll use my context, like domestic violence. So like they want, let's say it's a couple that I'm working with who they both acknowledge that they're in a dynamic where there's situational violence going back and forth, and they both want the violence to stop. Maybe would the measure perhaps be then the amount of times they're in violence, or like how would you start to think or craft about the
Well, years ago, I wrote a paper on spouse abuse, one of my many unpublished papers. And the metaphor is really a rubber band. And that is within the relationship, they pull the rubber band until it snaps. And with domestic violence, it's always a symmetrical system.
Hmm.
Do you know Bateson's idea of symmetry and complementarity? Okay, we've got work to do here.
yeah.
Bateson has an article, the cybernetics of alcoholism, and it's in his book, Steps to the Ecology of Mind. And that's just a chapter. And his theory, just to digress, with alcoholism, that what diffuses the conflict between the parents, between the people, is the person starts to drink. With the spouse abusers, the issue is how do they diminish the symmetry in their relationship? Because the abuse only happens when the rubber band snaps.
I see. Fascinating.
And you really want them to understand, especially the wife, who's, I assume, the victim, to understand as the rubber band starts to get stretched, they change the topic. So they're both responsible for the abuse.
Yeah.
My wife feels very strongly that the women are also very involved in this cascade of abuse. And the woman needs to realize what are the early warning signs and leave the room.
Yeah, there's a challenging history there of challenging but important, I guess, idea of how to start to think about dynamics in relational violence, in domestic violence, especially when some of the the history of victim blaming in the 20th century with some of the more second wave feminist pushback on how, I guess, domestic violence was conceptualized as often, the woman kind of is inviting it or whatever. So there was kind of this pushback against that, saying like, no, it's a matter of power and control. And I think you're bringing us into this important, I hope, more contemporary question that needs to be addressed carefully, especially by men, but an important one of like, well, if we're thinking about violence within a relational dynamic, how is each participant involved? Oh, you see, even finding the right language starts to make it politically sensitive.
Let me just, some of these things I can't see. I want to work with things I can see. I want the couple to be in the room to have a discussion where they come to a resolution. And I'm looking really at the threshold. And what I'm doing, if need be, I'm unbalancing.
Yeah.
You know, my book with Minuchin, we talk about the technique of unbalancing. And that is you side with one member or the other.
Right.
And it has to be done with these families very gingerly.
Yeah, very
but nevertheless, it's really powerful because the prestigious therapist is siding with the spouse. They then look at their spouse differently.
Yeah, that just imagining of that is both exciting and feels scary. So it takes some confidence to kind of engage with some of these approaches.
Well, yes and no. Yes, it does. I agree with you. But you can be really slow and gradual.
Yeah.
Now, the other issue is these are families from the Middle East that you're working with.
Yeah. So just for context for the listener, I was introducing myself to Charles a little bit before this and sharing about how my work is situated in San Diego with Middle Eastern families and domestic violence. Refugees. Yeah. So yes, you're correct.
and it's a different culture, I know, and but nevertheless, they're no longer living
In the Middle East. Yeah.
in the Middle East. They're living in a place where it's not this behavior towards women is never tolerated, zero tolerated,
Hmm.
and so it's and they need to both be accountable to that, and they're both responsible for mitigating this problem. The woman by having zero tolerance for abuse
Yeah.
and just leaving the room whenever she sees it getting hot.
Yeah. A lot to think about here, Charles, because I think you're bringing forward some like theoretical ideas that, like you said, are so effective and also have been marginalized. And I mean, I can kind of like call back to it in my own training. Um, but even in my own training, I was trained much more heavily in the narrative therapy world. And in some ways, I was, as I understood it, kind of responding to some of the family therapy stuff and kind of questioning some of the foundational assumptions, I suppose, that family therapy was founded on. But also along the way, I've discovered I'm just a real zeal to like reconnect with that history and kind of understand how family therapists at the time were really making sense of the people they were working with. So hearing about your work with diabetes and anorexia and some of the ways that it was just like this one-to-one success rate is kind of hard to imagine in a way that it's exciting. Like I love hearing about that. It invites a lot of hope in some work that I do that feels sometimes
Well,
strange.
I'm glad to hear that. I mean, the family therapy is unbelievably powerful.
Yeah.
But you can't. It's harder to do it alone in the room.
Yeah.
You got to get the other spouse there to some extent.
Yeah.
Now, the issue is, and what I promote in the book is the idea that every clinician becomes a local clinical scientist.
Hmm.
And that is, we use these ideas to measure our performance.
I like the accountability embedded into that approach. Like it forces the therapist to look at hard data. And I say hard not just in terms of like grounded, but difficult maybe sometimes to confront about your own performance.
Exactly. And I'm a pathologically optimistic person. And I thought that if people are tracking their outcome, they will by necessity go to family therapy.
Hmm.
This other stuff doesn't work.
Yeah.
Unless it's the word well, then everything works.
Yeah. Charles, it's been such a pleasure to be talking to you today. I want to acknowledge a couple things as we're wrapping up here. First, I want to just say that like you were saying that as you've gotten older and as you're coming to 2024 with your ideas and this rich history you hold, my thinking has gotten simpler. And I want to acknowledge that there's a depth and a breadth and a complexity in what you're saying. I don't know. I guess there's a way that I'm hopeful that someday I can say that because I think to acknowledge that and say that there's a humility in that I'm here, like picking up on because yeah, what you're saying is you just housed in a lot of rich experience and real deep critical thought on the work you're doing. So the simplicity, I think, I don't know, like when I watch a good drummer or a good piano player and they make something like easy and simple,
Right.
but that's because it's you're watching decades and decades and hours and hours and hours of practice is why.
The people, this book talks about the 10,000 hours.
Hmm.
I've had much more than 10,000 hours, but
Yeah.
the issue is really how to make it simpler. And you say in your own work, in your own teaching, you want to give people pretty simple interventions because then they'll become family therapists. People really cross the bar in the family therapy world when they see the tremendous power of the model.
Yeah. Yeah, so I want to acknowledge that like when you're saying my thinking has gotten simpler, that I hear it a little, yeah, like any good piano player who plays something simply. I want to just, convey a lot of respect towards you in that regard. And I want to also
Well,
just,
it's also,
sorry, please.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but the question is if someone's a really good jazz musician, they really know the chords. And the good family therapist knows what are the chords.
Yeah.
And they're not that different. Maybe different. They're different than music, but in terms of family therapy,
I know what you mean.
family of the family, it's the same patterns.
Yeah.
It may be more difficult if you're struggling with families where it's de rigueur that the husband can beat up the wife. They ain't here anymore. They ain't there anymore.
Yeah. No. Yeah, I think there's something to that. Yeah, and I also just wanted to, as we're wrapping up here, Charles, also make space for you to perhaps say the name of your book again, and perhaps, how people, what your hopes were for this book, and maybe how people might be able to engage with it.
What is the second thing you said?
Like so as you share about the book, like what is the context or like the audience that you're hoping for with the book and how they might engage with some of your writing?
I want family therapy. I want clinicians of all sorts, especially family therapists, to learn these ideas. And there's a much simpler model of structural family therapy. But to learn these ideas, the whole idea in medicine, there was a lot of research saying that a lot of the flawed, greatly respected medical theories don't work. The books were cooked. And you have a neighbor there at Stanford, John Ioannidis, who's a brilliant researcher and clinician. And when I last checked, he had 20,000 refereed articles.
Oh my gosh.
But I quote, I know you're trying to wrap up, but I'll just take a minute.
Please.
That none of the therapies work. Mental health treatment is gigantically expensive, and most of them don't work. And even the man who was the medical director, chief director of NIMH, after working there for 20 years, I'll find his name right now. After working there for 20 years, he said, I've spent $20 billion. We've published some cool papers. There's still a number of people on the streets, and nothing's really dented. Nothing's dented. Yeah. My goal is that every family therapist, at least family therapist, doesn't say that. They said they've had good results.
Yeah, that's a beautiful vision.
And they've tracked those results.
I love that. And so your book is family therapy technique. No, sorry, performance-based.
Performance-based family therapy.
Yes.
A therapist's guide to measurable change, and published by Routledge. About a year and a half ago.
Well, congratulations on that huge achievement. It seems like it sits on decades and decades of work and history.
Well, that's true. Yeah. And thank you so much for the interview and for your interest.
Of course, it's been a real pleasure and treat.
Okay.
Yeah, there's ways that you're having me think about my practice that, you're having effects on how I'm thinking about my work in ways that I appreciate.
Oh, good. I'm glad of that.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Charles.